inaugural podcast where I embrace spirituality, scripture, and the human sciences to further understand the scriptures and hopefully provide a different perspective on the teachings. My name is Peter Doherty. I've been a Catholic priest for 37 years and a psychologist for 25 years. I've been interested in creating a podcast that integrates scripture and the behavioral sciences for almost 3 years now. I am in a unique position with training in both psychology and scripture to provide unique reflections on scripture. I also wanted to reach out to those with mobility issues, those who are looking for another perspective on scripture, and I'm also thinking of my brother priests and ministers who may be looking for ideas for their homilies and sermons. The podcast will be about 10 to 15 minutes in length and will hopefully give you insights into the teachings from scripture. I'd like to give you some idea of the lens I have on Scripture and how this podcast is going to unfold. Many people are suspicious of psychology. I blame Freud for this. He saw religion as very much an illusion. For centuries, psychology and religion have been skeptical of each other, not appreciating each other's gifts. Hopefully, we will see the reconciliation and cooperation between these sciences before too long. Already, I'm seeing examples of where these two disciplines can enrich each other and provide a powerful impact on the lives of human beings. I want to point out that I view spirituality without psychology to be pietism, while psychology without spirituality is behaviorism. Spirituality is not something out there, but must be grounded in the human experience. And human beings are more than just our thoughts and behaviors. We search for meaning, and we recognize that there is more than we can see and feel. This perspective, I'll be sharing my reflections on Scripture from the dual lens of psychology and spirituality. At this stage, I'll be focusing on Sunday's readings, usually the Gospel. I welcome your questions and thoughts and insights. You can send them to me through my email address at peter.dohertyomi, dohertyomi@gmail.com. Depending on the questions, I may dedicate some of the time during the podcast to address your questions. One of the concerns I have is that while so many people do fully appreciate the richness of Scripture, they are sometimes satisfied too early or misunderstand what Scripture is about. The worst case scenario is when people use Scripture to justify their position. Usually they have a particular moral position and look for the Scriptures to justify their position. While I'm glad and impressed that people are choosing to seek guidance from the Scriptures, I'm also concerned that they might get the wrong idea. Unfortunately, there are verses in Scripture that are difficult to understand unless one knows the context in which these events occurred. Also, people can underestimate the impact of their own culture when interpreting Scripture. The Bible has been used to justify slavery and misogyny, just to mention two. To help illustrate this point, I thought the first inaugural podcast will focus on understanding Scripture. There are a couple of general principles that readers need to know when understanding the Gospels. One thing to keep in mind is that Israel at the time was occupied by the Roman army. It was part of the Roman Empire. Many people believed at the time that the Messiah would be the one who would lead the people to overthrow the Roman government and free their country. With these expectations, they expected Jesus, as the Messiah, to lead the rebellion. Of course, they would have trouble accepting Jesus as the Messiah when he made no intention to overthrow the government and avoided situations when the people wanted to make him king. Jesus even challenged the Pharisees, Sadducees, and scribes. He was supportive of traditionally disadvantaged people, for example, women, children, and prostitutes. He didn't win any points with people who were content with the status quo. Jesus did not discriminate against the tax collectors, who were cooperated with the Romans and were thus seen as traitors. The most well-known tax collector, as you probably know, was Matthew, who ended up writing one of the Gospels. Jesus spoke even to Roman centurions and healed his servant, and seemed sympathetic to the Samaritans, who were looked down upon. Jesus made it very clear his kingdom was not of this world. For many people, they could not understand how Jesus could be a liberator while the people were still under Roman occupation. The next point to remember is that people believed that after Jesus ascended into heaven, that the second coming would happen in their lifetime. There are several passages in Scripture suggesting that Jesus was going to return soon, such as John chapter 15, 1-3, and Revelations 22:10. The Gospels were handed down orally. It didn't make sense to write anything down if the world would end shortly. It's only after approximately 30 years after the death of Jesus that attempts are made to preserve the Scriptures by writing them down. Also, many of these teachings need to be interpreted in light of the fact that people expected the world to end soon, and thus there was no time to make significant social changes. It's likely that the historical facts may have been altered somewhat, even though the teachings remained intact. You may have heard the statement that all Scripture is from God, and the interpretation will be obvious. Sadly, this is not true. Yes, Scripture is inspired, but it's also filtered through the realities of cultural values and time. There are some Bibles called the red letter Bibles that have the words of Jesus in red ink. The point is, Jesus did not speak English. Keep in mind that the writers of the Gospels did not run around with tape recorders or notebooks writing everything down. The writers had to depend and try to remember things that happened over 30 years ago. We need to remember that much of the Scripture was written years after the events took place. They were likely remembered events that were significant to the people at that time. Writers of Scripture were not concerned about chronological order or even make sure the author got their credit. For example, it was not unusual for writers to list the authorship of their writings to someone they admired. I invite you to join me in this exercise that will help you understand my points. Suppose for a moment I intercepted a love letter between two people. The letter was dated just last week. How much of the letter do you think I would understand? I'm guessing about 95% of the letter, because the letter is written in English. But I don't know the couple. I will likely miss some of their references to their past or plans for the future. Now suppose that letter was written 100 years ago. How much of the letter would I understand? People would not have understood computers, let alone the internet. The world was a very different place. Customs around dating would have radically changed. Is it safe to say that I'd lose another 10%? Sounds now I'm down to 85%. Now say the letter is written in Greek. Now the good news is I have a good English-Greek dictionary. I think, however, I would lose another 10%. Likely, some of the nuances would be lost due to translation. Ever try to tell a joke in another language? Rarely does it work. Now I'm down to 75%. So within 100 years, I've lost 25%. May not sound like much, but we are looking at a book that was written over 2,000 years ago. That's 20 times the time difference. I am often asked what edition of the Bible is the best. Right off the top, I'd have to say the one with the least translations. The Bible translation you're using is probably a result of several different translations. I often wonder what percentage I will lose when cultural values are taken into account. It might be tempting to give up, wondering what's the use of studying Scripture. The good news is that with serious study, we can gain insight into what the writer was trying to communicate. The truth of the Bible remains, but we need to unpack the cultural impact. There's a joke going around that does have some interesting points. It raises the issue that I want to comment on. The story goes that many centuries, a young monk was assigned the task of helping his fellow monks make copies of the Bible. This was in the days before the printing press, so copies had to be made by hand. After the young monk had been at this task for a few months, he went to the abbot and asked, how do the monks know they are copying the Bible correctly and not copying some mistake made centuries earlier? The abbot was intrigued with the question and decided to investigate. He went down into the vault where they kept their old manuscripts. The abbot found the earliest version of the Bible and read it. Days passed, and the abbot did not return. Finally, a group of senior monks went to the vault and found the old abbot weeping. He exclaimed, "It says celebrate, not celibate." The story is fictitious and funny, but it does raise important challenges that we need to be wary of interpretations that were made too quickly. We have to approach the scriptures with some humility and caution. The good news is that various disciplines of science like archaeology, anthropology, the human sciences, and linguistics have given us insight into the writings of the Bible and tools to unlock its teachings. My final point is I'm reminded of Mary, the mother of Jesus, who pondered in her heart, Luke chapter 2, verse 19, what Jesus told her. I urge you to ponder in your heart what you hear today and in future podcasts. We have a wonderful example for everyone who follows Jesus. Let us be prepared to ponder in our hearts the wisdom that Scripture bestows on us. Thank you for joining me. I wish you all the best, and join me next week when we talk about the parable of the workers in the vineyard. God bless, and have a great week.